of global trade. I'd like to thank those who are present here, our speakers, as well as those who are joining us online from different parts of the world. We really appreciate your time and attention, and we look forward to having a very exciting and interesting session this morning. So I'm going to start by just a few housekeeping announcements, particularly for those who are joining us online. We'd kindly ask that you can keep your microphone muted. You can put on your camera if you like and smile. We're okay with that. If you do have any questions or interventions, we'd kindly ask, particularly those who are joining us virtually, if you can show by raising your hand or putting your question within the chat function so that we can address those and put those to the speakers that you will be liaising with during the course of today. So I would like to start today's proceedings by inviting the Senior Director of the Trade, Oceans and Natural Resources Directorate at the Commonwealth Secretariat, Mr. Suresh Yadav, to provide opening remarks. He's joining us virtually from London this morning, and we'd like to thank you very much. Suresh, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasti. Can you hear me? I hope I'm audible to you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasti. Distinguished guests and colleagues, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to this workshop on legal reforms and digitalization of global trade. The Commonwealth Secretariat is pleased to collaborate with the Caribbean Telecom Union in hosting this workshop as we recognize the need to foster cooperation among key development partners within the region. To this end, we are also very grateful to receive the invaluable input and support from representatives from the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, the International Chamber of Commerce, the St. Kitts and Nevis Chamber of Industry and Commerce, as well as other esteemed panelists who will be engaging in a multi-sectoral regional panel discussion on what are the prime movers for catalyzing trade and investment in the Caribbean region. The Commonwealth Secretariat fully supports the move towards paperless trade as we recognize the transformational impact of digitalization and legal reforms in support of digital trade. The Commonwealth leaders adopted the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda at the Commonwealth Heads of the Government meeting in April 2018 with a view to boosting trade and investment links across the Commonwealth and raising intra-Commonwealth trade to 2 trillion by 2030. Within the past 6 years, the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda had been championing in supporting member states in their sustainable digital transformation journey as we recognize the tangible economic benefits that can be derived from strategic digitalization as well as supporting legal reforms to enable the digital economy. In the report on the quantitative analysis of the move to paperless trade in 2022, it was clearly outlined that the digital trade facilitation across border would increase trade across the Commonwealth by around 90 billion US dollar, and legal reforms to support the digitalization of the electronic records could unleash as much as 1.1 trillion US dollar, bringing the total benefit from the paperless trade to nearly 1.2 trillion by 2026. The use of digital trade documentation will speed up and make more secure the process of accessing trade finance, reduce cost, as well as provide a route to address the issues of risk related to fraud, anti-money laundering, and know your customers, which are endemic in emerging markets. Concurrently, enabling regulatory reforms would provide the private sector with an incentive to use new technology to create new markets, including the services. Digital transformation is not just about revolutionizing the trade ecosystem, it involves a holistic approach to bringing the different pieces and stakeholders together to build a resilient and sustainable digital ecosystem. Therefore, as we look to the empowering effects of digitalization, we also take into consideration the need to implement appropriate policies and regulations that deal with the consumer and data protection, dispute resolution, competition, and intellectual property rights within the digital markets. The entire ecosystem approach will enable the Commonwealth countries to garner a share of the artificial intelligence economy, which is likely to $16 trillion by 2030 in a global economy which is expected to reach 130 trillion by 2030 from present level of 100 trillion US dollar. The data, which is the backbone of AI, will be the gold mine for the member countries, and same will come out from the digitalization processes. Lack of digitalization will lead to AI divide in the countries if not addressed appropriately. It is with these priorities in focus that the Commonwealth Trade Ministers at the meeting held in London in June 2023 mandated the CCA to establish a working group on legal reforms and digitalization to assist member states in transitioning to the paperless trade ecosystem. The Legal Reform and Digitalization Working Group aims to provide resources, advocacy, technical assistance, information sharing, and policy recommendations to assist Commonwealth member countries in navigating the legal reforms necessary for a smooth transition from paper based to paperless trade. This ecosystem will enhance the efficiency, transparency, environmental sustainability of the Commonwealth trade, reduce cost, and ensure that the Commonwealth countries keep pace with evolving trends in the world trade ecosystems. We will take this opportunity to invite the Commonwealth member states within the Caribbean region to express their interest in participating in the deliberations and proceedings of the working group, and we greatly look forward to engaging with you. I would like to invite you to actively participate in the workshop, which had been co created by my colleague Vasti and Neil, who were on the ground with an open and questioning mind in understanding that the international practices, but most importantly, that what works best for each country is based on its own needs and also what is best for regional trade and development within the Caribbean region as a whole. I'll encourage you all to actively participate in the discussion, share your insights, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Your contributions are vital in shaping a more connected, innovative, and prosperous future for all the Commonwealth countries. I wish you all the best and hope that many of you will maximize your presence in this workshop and try to take few lessons which can be transformative in your own digital transformation journey as you do in your country. Thank you very much and wish you all the best. Over to you, Vasti.
Thank you very much, Suresh. And just a bit of information, particularly for those who are joining us online. Our Senior Director, Suresh Yadav, is also our Commonwealth lead in artificial intelligence and is really driving the work of the Commonwealth AI Consortium on artificial intelligence. And I'm sure that we'll be able to share more information for those of you all who want to get to know a little bit more about that and the work that we're doing in AI. So without more, I'm going to hand over to our presentation this morning on the economic benefits of the move to paperless trade. And I'm going to invite my colleague Niels to do a economic cost-benefit analysis and overview for everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vashti, and a very good morning to you all. It's nice to see our room filling up, our very, very warm room, so hopefully we have enough fans to keep us all comfortable over the next little bit. So as Vashti mentioned, my name is Neil Strasdens, Trade Specialist with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it'll be my job over the next 20 minutes or so to lay the foundation for the rest of our workshop and expand on the why and the how we can move to paperless trade across the region. So if I can ask our IT support to put the presentation slides on screen, please. Thank you very much. Let's just put that into presentation mode. Beautiful. Excellent, and good morning as well, good afternoon to those joining us online. Hopefully the slides are visible. So for those of you who attended our presentation on Tuesday, you've got a small slice of what I'm going to talk about today, but I'll be going into a bit more detail, particularly as it pertains to you all here in the Caribbean region. So I'm dividing this presentation into two parts, focusing mostly on the economic benefits, as Vashti mentioned, in moving to paperless trade. As you heard from our senior director, we commissioned research a few years ago to put some numbers behind the impetus to this move to help illustrate what we all have to gain by making the legal reforms necessary to enable paperless trade. And then in the second half, just to reinforce the work we're doing through our working group, as that's the reason we're here this week, to get you all to engage with the working group and move to paperless trade at pace across the Caribbean. You'll hear from our panel speakers in a little bit on the international momentum toward paperless trade. So this is really about helping the region keep pace with your trading partners. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, I've put this slide together because I think this helps contextualize the international context a little bit. So what you see are the countries that have so far enabled paperless trade. And then if we look at this, you'll see these are the Commonwealth countries within this group. That's nearly half. And there's two of these Commonwealth countries that I think are worth highlighting here. The first is Belize, as they are the first Commonwealth country in the Caribbean region to make the legal reforms necessary to enable paperless trade. Hopefully not the last and the first of many. And the second, and most importantly, is the United Kingdom. Now that's important because one of the many advantages we share across the Commonwealth are commonalities in legislation and legal traditions. So now that the UK, through the Electronic Trades Documents Act, has made these legal reforms in their legislation, it's relatively easy for countries that share these legislative foundations with the UK to follow suit. And the last point I'll make is you'll note all these countries are quite diverse. We have big economies, we have small economies, we have developed states, we have developing states, we have island states, including Kiribati. So there's no sort of limit or boundary to what type of country or at what stage of development is suitable to what we're talking about here today. So that's the foundation. Let's get into the numbers a little bit, and we'll start with the cost reductions, I should say, that are enabled through paperless trade. There's two sides to the equation. One is cost reductions, the other is additional trade generation. So looking at the Commonwealth-wide picture, just to contextualize. You can see here on the left, I know this is small, but this is mostly for illustrative purposes, the trade costs as a share of trade revenues that all of our member states experience at the moment. And there's four in particular that I've highlighted there. I know they're not in the Caribbean region, but they are important because for these four economies, trade costs actually exceed 100% of the trade revenues they generate. Now, that may sound counterintuitive, but the fact of the matter is, for many developing economies, they do not produce everything that they consume. They need to import most of what they consume, and to pay for those imports, you do need to export, even if it is at a loss. You also need to protect domestic industries, protect domestic jobs. So the fact of the matter is, even if it is economically challenging, you must engage in trade. So it is simply a must to get these costs down to encourage economic growth. So for those four economies, it's a particularly delicate situation, but for another 34 economies, trade costs exceed 50% of the revenue they gain from trade, and this needs to change. Moving to paperless trade is the most impactful way we can quickly get these costs down. So moving to the Caribbean region, so we have here three of the main costs involved in engaging international trade. These are the costs that our study looked at. Again, these might not be clear from where you're sitting. Hopefully online you can see them a little bit better, but we're very happy to share both the report as well as the statistics we have for your individual economies after the fact. But looking at what we have on screen here, we can see that persistently high trade costs across the Commonwealth Caribbean pose significant barriers to economic growth. These costs are driven by manual documentation, logistical inefficiencies, and lengthy customs procedures. Moving to a more digitized paperless system can alleviate much of this burden and help these economies become more competitive. And if we compare the costs in the Caribbean region to the Commonwealth average, we can see that many nations here do exceed this average by a substantial margin, and a few economies actually surpass 80% of trade revenues, which is much higher than the 50% Commonwealth average that you saw on the previous slide. And again, this disparity highlights, I think, the urgent need for reform in this region. So when we talk about reform, what is the impact that will have? This here is an illustration of the reduction in total trade costs we can see by reducing the time-consuming and costly paper-based processes that dominate trade in this region. Now, these reductions will result in faster customs clearances, reduced delays, and streamlined logistics, and also the elimination of costly inefficiencies that consume a significant portion of trade revenues, particularly in smaller and island economies. For instance, you can see here in economies like St. Lucia and Belize, border compliance costs exceed $1,000 per $25,000 shipment, which is a standard measurement in trade, a typical container amount. Moving to digitized processes could cut this dramatically. And beyond just cost savings, the broader impact in moving to paperless trade comes from reducing the unpredictability that businesses often face. You may hear shortly from one of our speakers, Chris Southworth from the International Chamber of Commerce, on the business implications. But suffice it to say that digitization leads to greater transparency, which makes it easier to track shipments, to verify compliance, to ensure timely delivery. And when businesses know they can rely on efficient, predictable processes, they are more likely to invest and expand their operations. So that's total trade costs. The next three slides will break down the three main trade costs I had mentioned earlier and the cost reduction that paperless trade can enable. So starting with border compliance costs, this is an area where digitization can have a dramatic impact. For example, in St. Lucia, Belize, and Guyana, border compliance costs exceed $1,000 per shipment, as I'd mentioned. The shift to digital documentation could reduce this by over 60% over a 5-year period. And I'll stress that all the figures you're seeing on these slides are a 5-year period, which was what we undertook in this study. It was a few years ago, so we are a little bit past the original study date, but the figures are generally still in the ballpark. So just imagine the 5-year period, if you will. So that was border compliance costs. The second one of the three are documentary compliance costs. For many exporters, particularly those in smaller economies, documentary compliance costs are a heavy financial burden. Paper-based compliance not only increases the financial cost, but also prolongs the time it takes to clear goods at the border. The potential for reducing these costs by up to 75% through digital systems could help economies move goods more efficiently and increase their overall trade capacity. And furthermore, digital compliance reduces errors, very important to stress. It reduces errors and the need for repeated documentation. Mistakes in paperwork often result in shipments being delayed for days, if not weeks. And by automating much of the documentary compliance process, we can significantly reduce human error and ensure smoother trade flows across borders. Now finally, let's move to transport costs, which represent one of the largest expenses for Caribbean economies. Nearly all countries here in the region exceed the Commonwealth average, as you can see from this data here. These costs in the region are exacerbated, as I'm sure we're all familiar, by geographic isolation, underdeveloped logistics infrastructure, and inefficient shipping practices. The shift to paperless trade can reduce transport costs by simplifying documentation, allowing for better coordination between transport networks, and reducing delays at ports. For example, in island economies where the goods trade relies heavily on sea transport, the costs of delays in port clearance can be significant, and paper-based systems often mean that goods are stuck at ports waiting for clearance, leading to demurrage charges and other costs. By moving to a system where documents can be processed electronically and in advance, we can dramatically reduce these waiting times and ensure goods move more freely. And the last point is that moving to paperless trade allows for better integration with international shipping systems as well. So we see a smoother flow of goods across borders and lower logistical costs. So putting all these cost reductions together, and again zooming out to the Commonwealth-wide picture, we see some very large figures that help illustrate the potential reality of the benefits in moving to paperless trade. Now again, ignore the small graph on the left. This is mostly for illustrative purposes to emphasize the point we're making here. So for example, for 25,000 ton unit, moving to paperless trade would reduce the average border compliance costs across the Commonwealth from $521 to just $99 over 5 years. It would reduce the average transport costs from nearly $17,000 to just over $4,000 over the same time period. And overall, moving to paperless trade would reduce average Commonwealth trade cost as a share of trade revenue from 63% to just 21% over 5 years. These are significant. So that's the cost reduction side of the equation. I'd mentioned earlier there's two sides to the equation, one being cost reduction, the other being additional trade. So turning to additional trade that we can unlock by moving to paperless trade, we get a picture of the transformational opportunity available for regional economies. By digitizing trade processes, countries such as Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, for example, as you see here, could potentially unlock more than $9 billion each in additional trade over a 5-year period. These gains are driven by the reduction in trade costs through faster border clearance, reduced reliance on physical documentation, and more efficient logistical operations. And these gains would furthermore be enabled through a combination of a reduction in trade costs and an increase in access to trade finance, as it's important to note that digitized documents themselves can become instruments through which additional finance can be enabled, and perhaps you might hear an expansion on that from our speakers in a moment. So that was for the Caribbean, and I'll leave the economic side of this with 3 points that if you were here on Thursday you saw as well, but these are big and it is important to hear this twice, and that's because the Commonwealth-wide potential is enormous. So one takeaway from this presentation hopefully will be these figures. So by reducing border and transport costs and tackling informal trade processes, we could unlock an additional $90 billion in Commonwealth trade. In total, with cost reductions and greater access to trade finance, we could see an increase in Commonwealth trade by $1.1 trillion by 2026, which again was the endpoint of the 5-year period we studied. And this brings the total potential benefits of moving to paperless trade across the Commonwealth to $1.2 trillion over just 5 years. Now these figures, they are aspirational, but they are achievable with the right legal reform. And with that, I will turn to the last part of my presentation, a few slides just to reiterate the work of our working group, which again is the reason we are here this week to work with you. And this is where we can engage and help you all make the transition to paperless trade. So I won't spend too much time on this, as some of you may have heard it before. I'll just run through the highlights, and with that it's just left to say that the working group, it was established by mandate by Commonwealth trade ministers last year, recognizing the importance in moving to paperless trade and keeping pace with international momentum in doing so. So the objective, as I mentioned, of course, is to help our members in move to paperless trade through legal reform, and the goal of the working group is to coordinate the removal of legal barriers preventing the digitization of commercial trade documents and the coherence of legal systems across the Commonwealth. At the bottom of the screen, you see the 3 pillars which the working group is structured around. It's worth noting these. The first is the Ministerial Task Force. This is comprised of senior officials from across the Commonwealth. In the middle sits the Steering Committee, where we are engaging with international and regional organizations that are involved internationally with the paperless trade transition to ensure everything is in alignment with global moves and that we have coherence. Co-chair of that Steering Committee is Mr. Chris Southworth, who will be on our panel in a moment. And finally, we have a legal consultative task force, and that is one area where we can immediately engage with you. This task force is comprised of technical experts from individual Commonwealth countries who have responsibilities or portfolios that touch on legislative reform, and they help to refine our work and ensure it is translatable at the country level. So the outputs of the working group, the primary output is the Commonwealth Model Legislative Text on Digital Trade. This will serve as a template for our member countries in undertaking the legal reform necessary and alignment to best practices. This takes into account, for those who may be familiar, models such as the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transferable records. So just to reinforce that the work we are doing is 100% in alignment with other international efforts, and we're not duplicating these efforts. So in addition to the legislative text, there are a few additional resources we are making available, such as legal reform roadmaps, case studies, and training materials. And importantly, we are undertaking regional pilot projects in each of the main regions of the Commonwealth to test and refine our frameworks and ensure that they are practical and implementable for our member countries. And these regional pilots are beginning in the Pacific later this year. So my last slide, ladies and gentlemen, is a simple call to action for you all to be involved in this effort. The figures you saw earlier, again, they are aspirational, but they also rely on us all moving together across the Commonwealth to unlock those large figures. There are also, one point to stress on those figures, they are estimates. But even if we achieve half of what you saw there, that is a transformational shift for all of our economies. If we achieve a quarter of what we saw there, that is still a transformational shift, all enabled through legal reform. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are two ways you can become involved. As I'd mentioned, engaging in our legal consultative task force by nominating your technical representatives to join the task force. We have a number of Commonwealth countries already involved in this effort, and it would be wonderful to see more from the Caribbean. And secondly, to become a regional pilot. I'd mentioned we're beginning in the Pacific with a few of our members there. We will be coming to the Caribbean as well. So if you do have interest in becoming a regional pilot, we very much are interested in speaking with you, and you can reach us for more information on the working group itself, or if you are interested, as I know there was some interest earlier in the figures we presented, we do have these available for every country in the Commonwealth. So if you are interested in these figures as well, feel free to reach out to Vashti, myself, or the team at those addresses there. So I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's again a pleasure. I'm hoping we're all comfortable still in this warm room, but I will hand back to Vashti for the next section of our workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. That was a very excellent presentation, and I think it frames the discussion that we're going to have next and puts into perspective what we are really here to do and what we're hoping to achieve. At this time, I'd like to invite the members of the panel to please join me at the head table. Oh, that was very kind. So I'd like to kindly indicate that this morning we're having a very diverse panel comprising of both in-person and online speakers. And I'd like to take the time to introduce the members of our panel. Firstly, I can start with Mr. Chris Southworth, who is online. Chris Southworth is the Secretary General of the ICC United Kingdom, but he's also the industry co-chair of the Business-to-Business Cluster Group of the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda with the Comisa Business Council. Chris is really a trailblazer, and he's also the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Trade that has been established. Prior to joining the ICC, he was the Executive Director for Global Partnerships at the British Chamber of Commerce, head of the International Chamber of Commerce of the Commerce Unit of the UK government, and advisor to Lord Heseltine. I'm just also going to introduce the other members of the panel very, very briefly. We have with us as well Mr. John Gregory, who is also joining us virtually. John Gregory practiced commercial law in Toronto, then joined the provincial government, where for over 30 years he developed legislation and policy in ADR, private international law, and information technology. He was a member of the Canadian delegation to the UNCITRAL Working Group on Electronic Commerce for 15 years, and he was also on our team for the development of the Commonwealth Model Law on Electronic Commerce in 2002. Welcome, John. And our in-person panelists, I'm pleased to introduce to you Mr. Nigel Carthy, who is presently the Chief of Digital Transformation and spearheads the Digital Transformation Project for the Government of St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Carthy served as a Minister of State with the responsibility for ICT, and I'm sure that he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to our discussion this morning. With Mr. Carthy, we also have Sanya Allen, who is the Executive Director of the St. Kitts and Nevis Chamber of Industry and Commerce. She has over 10 years of experience advising legal trade professionals within various government ministries within CARIFORUM, academia, international governmental organizations, particularly the WTO and CROSSQ. And definitely one of my very dear colleagues who I've had the pleasure to work with and is a wealth of knowledge, brings a wealth of knowledge to our conversation, is Ms. Lisa Agard. She's currently the chairman of Canto C9, a working group established by the telecommunications operators in the Caribbean, advocating for the need for systemic traffic generators to contribute fairly and equitably to telecommunications network deployment and investment. Canto is a member of the CARICOM private sector organization, and Lisa will be representing that organization in our discussion this morning. So without more, I'm just going to kick off this morning's conversation by inviting each of our speakers, starting with you, Chris, to just give us a 5-minute overview on what is your perspective with regard to how legal reform can transform digital trade and what can be its potential impact within the Caribbean.
Thanks so much, Vashti, and it's a real pleasure to speak to you. I'm extremely disappointed I can't join you in the Caribbean. I'm here in cold Manchester, which is no fun whatsoever. But if I can just sort of set out a few of the sort of key issues that we're facing globally as well as within the Commonwealth, because I think the Commonwealth has a huge advantage here, and that's one of the big conversations we're having with my sort of UK hat on, in terms of the alignment on English law, the advantage we have across the regions and the collaborations that we have, and it's all about optimizing that. But the recent UNSCAP Commonwealth report, I think illustrated an awful lot of the reality that's going on. And I'm speaking purely from a business perspective here. When you look at this from a trade facilitation customs perspective, it all looks very positive. 60% of customs is digitalized. Actually, globally, that's much higher. It's more around the sort of 70, 80%. But we've got to ask ourselves, after 7 years of delivering the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, why is the system no more paperless today than it was 7 years ago? And that's quite a challenging question, but the answers are actually simpler than we think, as long as we align the efforts going forward. And the reason is because we're solely focused, or too focused, on customs from a government perspective, and trade facilitation from a government perspective. And the reason is because customs and trade facilitation is not driven, or digital trade driven by governments. Governments are only a small part of the overall ecosystem. The reason we haven't actually translated into a digitalized trading system is because we've lagged behind on the need for legal reform in the first instance. And that means we need to nationally align our laws to the UNCITRAL model laws on electronic commerce, electronic signatures, and electronic transferable records. MELITA is the big push at the moment. If you do those things, the benefits that we are seeing for those that have done it are unbelievably positive. We have cut trade transaction times from 2 to 3 months to 1 hour. We've cut trade transaction costs 80%, cross-border processing times 80%, shipping times and costs 18%. These are huge growth and productivity figures if we scale the benefits, and that's the crucial question. So I think going forward, my main message from a business point of view to the Commonwealth and the global community, but I'll come back to the Commonwealth because I think we have a big advantage from a competitive point of view here, is we must stop talking about just customs as if that is the answer to a paperless trading system. We've got to start to look at this holistically and join up so that we're talking about a digitalized trade ecosystem, because most of that ecosystem is, of course, the private sector and all the private sector systems that are related to the processes of buying and selling, shipping, insuring, financing goods. And that's why we need to focus so much more on that sort of wider, broader ecosystem. So what do we need to focus on? First and foremost, the biggest barrier is legal. There are too many countries that are just lagging behind the legal environment. And that means we need to, like I say, align our legal frameworks up to the UNCITRAL model laws, especially the Melita framework. And we need to lean in much, much harder, we being governments, on data harmonization. Legal, just changing the laws themselves is nowhere near enough. In many ways, that's the easy part. The much harder part that will make the real difference is data harmonization. And the role of governments is critical. That's one of the big lessons that we're learning, is just changing the laws is simply not enough. It will not deliver a paperless system unless the governments themselves, or governments in general, lean in much harder to look at the incentive environment around enabling the transition from a paper-driven system to a data-driven system, and then companies will respond. But at the moment, what we're seeing from companies from the UK side, internationally, I don't think it really matters. It's the same message everywhere we go, is companies are completely overwhelmed with lots of the challenges around trade and global supply chains. The general mindset is we do what we do because we've done it for 200 years. That's not good enough. We've got a big opportunity here to modernize the system. And the complete lack of incentives from government. And when I say incentives, I'm talking about pulling all the levers that government has in order to enable and incentivize and message to companies, this is what we are doing outside of just customs. To give you a couple of examples of what governments can do, governments have huge procurement systems. If you e-transact on procurement systems, that in itself will shift the market much faster than we think. If we send, or government sends, simple messages that we will digitalize systems by X date, then that in itself will send us an important signal for companies to then unlock the investment, which is there. Investment and funding is not the issue. What they need is a simple message from government and a call to action to say, this is what we need to do by X date, and this is why, and then companies will respond. And then companies at the moment are completely overwhelmed with all the geopolitical risk. There's a tsunami of regulatory requirements coming on top of them for, in terms of sustainability in particular. But they're also dealing with a tremendous amount of friction, which you've just seen on the screen from Niels. I describe this as a bit like looking at a glass full of water, and now we're pouring more water, which is now tipping all over the table. We need to empty some of that glass, i.e. remove some of the friction, in order to give the private sector more headspace to know how to manage the sustainability requirements, which we all know are the right direction of travel. More transparency, more security, the ability to know exactly where the goods are coming from, to be nature positive, net zero. We cannot do all of that unless we start to deal with the existing trade system as it is today. Get off the paper, get into a data-driven system, lighten the load on companies in terms of friction and red tape. Then we can actually get ready and fit for purpose for dealing what we really need to deal with, which is the sustainability challenges up ahead. So, my general call to action here is very simple. We need to stop looking at trade through a customs lens. We need to look at this from an ecosystem perspective. Those in island states like the Caribbean and the Pacific have been super interesting from my perspective within the Commonwealth role, in the sense that you are the most trade burdened region in the world. There's every reason why we should do this. And within a Commonwealth perspective, we've got a huge advantage in terms of being more competitive if we align our laws, share best practice, look at that wider ecosystem and all the benefits. And that puts us in pole position to actually capture all the benefits for our SMEs. And ultimately, this is about more companies coming into the system, inclusion, less trade finance gap in terms of less trade finance costs, and actually making trade cheaper, faster, simpler, more secure, and more sustainable. And on the security piece, just to finish off, there's lots of concerns around things like cybersecurity, in terms of the sort of wider sort of risks around digital economy. But let me just pose you a thought. If you were to design a system today, there's absolutely no way anybody in the room would do that on paper. You'd do it in digital form, in the digital economy, because we all know that is far more secure than the paper system, where fraud, loss, delay, and all the other costs that come with it are all prevalent, more than prevalent, actually. This is costing us hundreds of billions of dollars every single year, which is ultimately a drag on economic growth and productivity. So here we are with a great opportunity. We have all the assets available through the Commonwealth program. It is the biggest digitalization program in the world today. We have the funding is there in the multilateral development banks. It just needs aligning, and that's what the MDBs are busy with now. For governments, it's about drawing down on that aligned funding, and we need to get more pressing on that front, especially with ODA funding as well. The funding is there if we put the pressure into the system to draw it down. With the International Center for Digital Trade and Innovation, if I can just put that cap on for a moment, we have created that specifically as a community interest company for the trade community, because we know that the alternative is expensive advisories and consultancies, when actually we can do this for better value for money. We can do it at scale with the right expert for you and everybody else, and we can drive that through the Commonwealth. That opportunity is there. And then, of course, we're going to hear from the team here on the panel, in terms of we have the legal frameworks, we have the alignment, and we have the case studies. Let's not forget, we've got over 44 case studies from businesses on the benefits that I've just listed out. And the question is, how many more case studies do we need to see before we start taking action? Because every single case study is delivering enormous benefits. And I don't know about everybody else, but I can't see those kind of growth and productivity figures anywhere else in the trading system except on this particular program. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I'll be around for the rest of the event for questions and answers. But let's work together. That comes up over and over again. Together we are stronger. None of us can do it on our own. This is the moment. And if it's not now, when are we going to do it? The timing is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your very, I would say, very credible call to action. And, framing it from an international perspective. We're also pleased to have the Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce of St. Kitts, who I believe is going to really stress upon the importance of that enabling environment and why it's important to St. Kitts and the region as a whole. Sanya, over to you.
Hi, thank you, everyone. and thank you to the Commonwealth Secretariat for this opportunity to be on this panel. So I just want to start by referencing the assessment of digital trade and e-commerce readiness and associated capacity building needs in 6 member states report that would have been funded by the Commonwealth Secretariat. And from this report, it indicated that St. Kitts and Nevis is signaling that they're open towards digital transformation. The data illustrates that the jurisdiction is moving towards putting certain fundamental blocks in place, starting off with the electronic transactions legislation from 2019, the Electronic Crimes Act, the data protection legislation, and as well the virtual assets legislation. Now, the private sector is always willing to work within the frameworks that are set by the state, and as such, the private sector is also not only willing to work, but is also a consumer. Because if you were to look at legislation as a good or a product or a service, it is also a consumer, so it needs to ensure that there's robust legislation in place. Certain aspects of the framework need a little bit more bolstering and support. And this is not a critique, it is just what it is. The private sector consistently looks at, not only as my colleague from the International Chamber of Commerce indicated, looked at trade from the perspective of the movement of goods and services across borders, but is also facilitating the uptake of innovation, of digital tools and digital vehicles to encourage investment. And so the question that the private sector, the St. Kitts and Nevis perspective, would be, how do we then operationalize, maximize, and start to incentivize persons to get into that space, particularly with the passage of the virtual assets legislation? We know that the registry is up and running, but it would be lovely to find out what has been the uptake in terms of the investment under that framework. Additionally, with respect to the legislation that is in place, there are certain other assurances, verification systems that need to be put in place. So not only legislation can cover that, there are other frameworks that could support that sort of a mechanism, such as standards. We're adopting the international standards that are being developed by the International Standards Organization that can provide some support in bolstering the system, which doesn't mean that we're legislating and necessarily regulating. We're using market-driven tools, such as standards, to support the private sector to uptake, to be able to feel some degree of security and safety as they create these tools and innovate. From the report, it also indicated that though the government is moving towards putting the framework in place, we're having a little bit of a lag with respect to the uptake by the general population. And that's an opportunity for the public sector and the private sector to work together to improve the knowledge of the general consumer in terms of being more comfortable with respect to digital trade and digital trade tools. So things such as mobile banking, depositing of checks virtually. These are tools that were put in place to support not only the general public, but also to enable the private sector to be innovative. We have to look now at how do we incentivize not only the general public, but those vulnerable groups, women and the differently abled persons, to be able to get more involved, because they may be able to provide services and be able to obtain remuneration through digital commerce, such as e-commerce platforms. But I don't want to dominate the conversation because I know the rest of the panel is probably going to touch on exactly what I've been saying, or most thereof. But I just wanted to just touch on something quickly that colleague from ICC indicated with respect to border. And customs administration seems to be a bugbear in the Caribbean. But that is not to say that customs administration is not trying its best. We all know that through UNCTAD, the implementation of Ascuda World, and through other initiatives such as the single electronic window in jurisdictions like Trinidad and Tobago have been adopted. In St. Kitts and Nevis, Ascuda World is a system that is being utilized, but its implementation is quite limited to customs administration. So there's need now to widen the scope and include the broader trade facilitation framework, so as to facilitate ease of doing business, that single one-shop system that we all keep speaking about. So we have to then drill down to the nitty-gritties of interoperability between such a system and the existing system. I know I won't go there, I'll leave it to the IT expert to go into that. But these are the real issues, and how does that information get out to the private sector to assist the private sector to have the information with respect to fees and charges in a transparent manner, and even encourage, and I throw it out to the other panelists, the adoption of advanced rulings, on customs goods, on goods and entering the jurisdiction. So, as I started off by stating, the government signals it is heading in the right direction. The private sector continues to be a willing partner on this drive, where it would innovate and support, being at the table and assisting in feeding into the policy development and legislative development that would assist the private sector to be competitive in this digitalized space. And what I will also leave as a last point is that leveraging these international partnerships are always beneficial. It is known that states throughout the Caribbean have been working with different international agencies, such as the Commonwealth Secretariat, the World Bank, Caribbean Development Bank, and another of the international either development or funding institutions to create solutions to some of these administrative hurdles. The private sector welcomes that and encourages it, and also extends a hand to also these international development partners to even consider working along with the private sector, because as my colleague Chris, if I may call him by his first name, stated, it's an ecosystem approach. And so stakeholders should be at the table. And so I hand it over to the moderator.
Brilliant, Sandhya. It is indeed an ecosystem, working hand in hand with the international organizations, the business sector, and most importantly, the enablers for digital transformation, the governmental sector. And I think at this point, I will invite Mr. Nigel Coffey to just really highlight the interest and the importance of digital transformation to national and regional economies, and how we can work closely with the private sector to advance that.
Well, thank you, Vashti, for the opportunity, and thanks to the Commonwealth Secretariat for giving us this opportunity to have this discussion. I want to start off by saying that trade reform is really a subset, as I see it, of digital reform. Moving towards paperless trade is just one of the facets of digital transformation that we talk about when we talk about this kind of transformation. And I also want to make a remark on the frustration which has been exhibited by the private sector through the representative of the private sector on this panel. But we find ourselves in a cycle where, because we have not yet adopted digital transformation to the extent that we ought to, we have these inefficiencies and bureaucratic strangleholds that we need to get rid of. But I think we're moving in the right direction. The government of St. Kitts and Nevis has signaled, and many of the countries throughout the region have signaled their move towards digital transformation. And doing that in a uniform way across the space would help a great deal. I want to speak to three main areas, and I hope very, very briefly. The power of digital transformation, the importance of legal reforms, and lastly, the importance of partnerships. Niels would have spoken at length to the value of digital transformation in bringing efficiency and heightening productivity in businesses. And businesses across the landscape, large businesses, small and medium enterprises, across the entire region, need to move towards, as swiftly as possible, the adoption of technologies that would enhance their productivity and efficiency. That will do a lot for the economic development of our region. The other important point I want to make here is that under digital transformation, we're hoping to catalyze training in a number of important areas. We pride ourselves on the penetration of digital services in our various countries, but I think we need to think about the whole spectrum of skills that young people need to be engaged in. Not just to be basically computer literate, but we need people who have training in cybersecurity, who are technicians, and who can perform a range of tasks to support a growing ecosystem as we embark upon digital transformation and provide a way of life for themselves and help to build the economy of St. Kitts and Nevis and the other economies of the region. We also see as an important aspect of digital transformation digital transformation within government itself. A lot of what happens in the economy of St. Kitts and Nevis, and indeed of any country, depends to a large extent on the services which the government renders and the form in which the government is able to offer these services. So if we talk about trade, the platforms that the government has, whether it's at Inland Revenue, Customs, wherever we, as businesses, we engage to pay our taxes or to engage in the trade that we would wish to, there is the need for government to really up its game in terms of providing the platforms that enable businesses, large and small, to engage in trade in a way that is paperless, in a way that offers interoperability. And operability mainly indicates that across the region, across the entire space, even throughout the Commonwealth, we need common platforms that can speak to each other to facilitate trade. I can also speak about how digital transformation can indeed strengthen our regional integration efforts, sharing information and so on, but I think that that's a matter that we can get into some discussion if we get into the discussion phase. Law exists to create order, to maintain order, to facilitate orderly change. And so to the extent that technology is changing rapidly, that it provides opportunities for good actors and bad actors, for businesses, small and large, for citizens who are well-to-do and people who live in impoverished, deprived areas of our country. It's important then that we provide legislative frameworks that facilitate the orderly development of our countries in the digital space. So we talk about AI, for example. That seems to be a buzzword these days and very much on the lips of people. And often when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about the opportunities, but we also talk about the threats. And therefore, it's going to be important for governments to provide regulation that help to prescribe and at the same time enable what we can do in respect of artificial intelligence. I think the presenter from the Chamber of Industry and Commerce would have spoken to the need for standardization. Trade requires standardization. That is part of the facilitation that has to happen if you're going to not just become paperless, but really draw down on the benefits which paperless trade offers. We're going to have to come up with standards for how we perform this trade, and standards in terms of payment and payment systems and transactions and electronic transactions in particular. So that is going to be critically important. Another important aspect of the reform that has to take place in respect of the legal aspect of things has to do with protecting the privacy of our citizens, but at the same time making sure that we create open governments that enable our citizens to understand and appreciate what their governments are doing. This is critically important for us in St. Kitts and Nevis, as I know it's important for countries across the region and the world as well. Open government. Getting our citizens to become involved as much as possible in the governance arrangements of our countries. And the last point I'll make on this, although there are many other points that can be made in relation to using law to create a level playing field for small, medium enterprises in a world where large businesses can very quickly dominate a space and exclude others from participating. But I also want to make a plug for intellectual property protection. Technology provides an opportunity for all of us, wherever we are from, to innovate, to create. And therefore, it's going to be critically important that we develop a regime and a framework for the intellectual property of our citizens to be protected. And lastly, I want to speak to the importance of partnerships. Our being here today is a demonstration of the importance of partnership. We've all come because partnerships throughout the region, but across the Commonwealth, are critically important. The Caribbean Telecommunications Union, the CTU, has hosted this week activities because we feel that collaborating across the space on issues as important as technology, is important. And not just because we're small, but because technology makes the entire space, global space, a small space. And we have to develop systems, devise systems, and interoperate in a way that is as smooth as possible. And so working with regulators, working with the business community, working with civil society organization to develop the kinds of regimes that we want, to advocate for the things that promote inclusion and economic development, empowerment for young people. All those things are critically important. And if we are going to make what we're doing sustainable or achievable in the first place and subsequently sustainable, then it's important that we bring all of our partners on board. The Commonwealth, the CTU, the ITO, the CTO, and all organs of the region and organizations within our various countries. So I am open for questions to delve a little deeper into these topics. Thank you.
Excellent intervention, Mr. Cotty. And, touching on the importance of partnerships across the region, I'd really like, Lisa, to invite you to bring your perspective from a regional approach. What areas of legal reform has the greatest ability to make that impact? Because we understand the importance of digital transformation, but what do you think we can do or focus on?
Sure. So, Vashti, before I get into that, because I have a lot to say about that, I have been working in this area for well over 20 years. But let me tell you a little bit about the CPSO. So the CPSO is the CARICOM Private Sector Organization, which is an agency of CARICOM. And its principal members comprise all of the largest enterprises operating and trading in the Caribbean and internationally. So it includes the Massey Group of companies, the Anson McCall Group of companies, the Musson Group of companies, the Goddard Enterprises, and many more. One of the strategic objectives and priorities of the CPSO is the facilitation of trade in goods. And as you all know, the free movement of goods enabled by trade facilitation is a fundamental tenet of the CARICOM single market and economy. And obviously a regionally harmonized trading environment can better position CARICOM private sector to integrate competitively into the global value chains. I want to go back, and Vashti, I haven't forgotten your question. I want to go back to some figures that Neil presented. And you understand numbers appeal to the private sector. And 90 billion could be added to the Commonwealth trade if border and transportation costs alongside with the costs associated with the informal economy could be reduced. Combining the impact of cost reductions and greater access to finance, there could be as much as 1.1 trillion US dollars, not EC dollars, TT dollars, US dollars increase in Commonwealth trade by 2026, giving you an aggregate benefit from paperless trade of 1.2 trillion US dollars by 2026. Let those numbers sink in, folks. And as Neil said, even if we can accomplish 50% of that, those kinds of numbers will be transformational for our economies. On behalf of the CPSO, I have 3 words to say. Count us in. In fact, we met with a colleague of Chris literally about a month ago in Barbados from the International Chamber of Commerce, who presented to us on the digital standards initiatives and working on trade facilitation. She was doing a whirlwind tour to Latin American countries and the Caribbean to encourage us through the private sector, helping to partner with governments on some of the reforms necessary to invite our full participation in these efforts. I am happy to report that the CPSO will be setting up a trade facilitation committee working with its executive members to push this agenda. So the legislative reform piece, Vashti, is critical in this area. And in that regard, Belize is to be publicly commended for the passage of their Electronic Transactions Act in 2021, which sought to give effect to 3 important conventions. One, the UNCITRAL E-Model Law on Electronic Commerce, the UN Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, as well as the very critical UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records. Nobody else in the Commonwealth Caribbean has passed similar legislation to give effect to the electronic transferable records. We need to get on board. But as Sanye pointed out, and Honorable Mr. Cogley, Nigel pointed out, that is just one piece in a legislative ecosystem that we must be cognizant of. Interestingly, UN-ECLAC did a survey last year, a sort of digital inclusion survey last year of several countries in the Caribbean, looking at telecommunications, universal service, electronic transactions, electronic signatures, data protection and privacy, cybercrime, e-money and e-payments, competition management, freedom of information, and intellectual property rights. Folks, the picture is not so rosy, based on the survey done by UN-ECLAC. Some states have some legislation, they don't have others. Some have, like Trinidad and Tobago, partially proclaimed legislation sitting on the books for many years. The administrative framework dealing with these diverse pieces of legislation sit in different ministries and different regulators. And so I urge us all today to look critically at our entire legislative ecosystem, not just dealing with digital trade, but that has to be given priority, but across the entire ecosystem, because we will be left behind. A little segue. I was invited to attend a conference in Washington a few weeks ago. And on the panel was a former chairman of the FCC. Big debate among the Americans. Oh, we have a dysfunctional Congress. We are leaders in world technology. And we cannot come together and arrive at a consensus about how to regulate artificial intelligence. And if we don't make the rules, people like Mark Zuckerberg will be making the rules. And the EU has passed legislation which has cross-border implication. Yeah. And I'm sitting there thinking, and in some countries in the Caribbean, we don't even have cybersecurity legislation. We don't have data protection legislation. We don't have so many things. And yet, United States, the mighty United States, is lamenting the fact that they themselves have not come to a place where they can arrive at consensus on regulating artificial intelligence. And nobody's even talking about robotics and the implications for how we work and we do business, and the necessity at some point in time maybe to regulate that. So folks, we need to get our act together in the Caribbean. And on behalf of the CPSO, we are ready to work with the Commonwealth, with the ICC, with the CTU, with CARICOM, with anybody that helps push this agenda forward and does so in a robust manner because we want to realize the kinds of benefits that Neil has outlined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I entirely agree. No one should be left behind. This is a common mantra by the Commonwealth Secretary General, Baroness Patricia Scotland. We do believe, and this is why we're undertaking this initiative, to try to ensure that there is that interoperability, that everyone is brought together and up to date with their legislation. I'm now going to invite the perspective of Mr. John Gregory, who is also one of the members of our panel. John has a wealth of experience in working with a lot of developing countries and looking at regional integration and harmonization of legislative approaches. And I'd like to invite John to share his perspective on what are some of the key priority areas that we can look at, drawing on what you have seen that works in other regions very well. John, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Is this working? You can hear me? Okay. Well, there's a lot to do in the law. As Chris Southworth said, the technology is not the problem, the law is the problem. Being a lawyer, I'm going to say, well, technology is a bit of a problem too, but law is my bailiwick. And I think part of it is what we've already heard. There is a sort of well-known sort of global legal framework for the law that's pretty accepted. And we just heard that from Lisa a moment ago. There is the UNCITRAL model laws that are a framework globally. They work. There's a number of other things. There's ways you can manipulate that. But I think for someone starting out, or for a country saying, okay, well, where do we start? Listen to what people are missing, to the extent that they know what they're missing. And some of the business people will know what they're missing. Some of the government people will know what they're missing. I've always said commercial law, which e-commerce law is a kind of commercial law, tends to follow business. It says it's the businesses figure it out what they want to do, and then the law comes around later and says, okay, yes, that works, but do it this way or that way to reduce some risks. But the business leads it. However, with technology, it's a bit more of a challenge, because you say, well, we can't do the technology unless the law's there. And the lawyers say, well, we can't do the laws until we know what kind of technology you want. So it's who moves first. And I think UNCITRAL has gone a long way to help with that by doing its model laws. And they're model laws because every country can tailor it to their own legal system and their own legal traditions. It's not you have to have every word of this document. It's, well, you can make this work, but this is how you approach it. And one of the first ways you do that is to remove the barriers in your existing law. And there are a lot of countries in the world, I'm living in one of them, and most of you, if not all of you, are living in others, who have had laws for years and years and years, centuries, if you go back that far, to say, this document must be done in writing, or this notice must be signed. And you say, okay, well, those are written in days when it was expected that that would be on paper. So what happens if you take the paper away? Can you still do that? How do you do that? What's writing? I remember a senior lawyer in Canada saying to me about 1996, well, there's no such thing as an electronic document. It makes no sense to talk about a document if it's electronic. Well, those days are long past. I think everybody just assumes that a document is electronic, and they probably assume now that what you see on the screen, what we saw with the slides this morning, that's writing you're seeing there, despite the fact it's electronic and nobody sees it on paper except maybe Niels, who was reading it. So we've made progress, but you need to go through your laws and say, okay, where do we fix that? And the model on electronic commerce, so as mentioned, is the first stage to say, okay, if the law makes you have writing, this is how you do it electronically. This is your standard, not this is exactly the words of your legislation necessarily, but this is what you're aiming at. And likewise with signatures, likewise with if you need an original document. You start with that, but then you move on. And I won't give you the history of the 25 years of UNCITRAL's work on electronic commerce and its model laws. And its convention, which it came along, as it was also mentioned, the Electronic Communications Convention, to say, all right, now we know how do we do that. We want people to do it exactly the same way. Convention is much more precise than a model law and demanding than a model law. You have to do it this way rather than figure out how you do it. The one that has been mentioned this morning by almost everybody is the model law on electronic transferable records, which it took UNCITRAL 20 years to get to because it was much harder. The first model laws all basically excluded and say, we do not apply to transferable records, documents of title, documents where on paper, having the paper gives you the right to the goods or to the money. A bill of lading is an obvious example for countries that live on shipping. That's what shipping lives on, is bills of lading. You have the bill of lading, you go and you get the goods, and you transfer that bill of lading so someone else can go to the goods. I can sell you the goods by transferring you the bill of lading. So it's really important that there's only one of them that works. You can't have 20 bills of lading and 20 people showing up at the dock or the warehouse to say, give me the goods. You only can have one. And when it was a paper original, that was one copy, you could do that. But electronics, of course, if you want 100, you just type into your computer 100, go, and then suddenly you have 100. And you send them to your entire mailing list. Now everybody's got one. So what do you do? How do you make that authoritative? And there are a number of other issues that come up with documents of title. Bills of lading are just one, warehouse receipts. Promissory notes is another. It's a document that gives you the right to money. How do you ensure that? And what UNCITRAL has done with that is essentially say it works in law if you have a reliable method to prove that this is the authoritative version, that this can be controlled, that this can be transferred, because you need to be able to transfer it. So if I have on my computer a promissory note or a bill of lading, if I transfer it to you, the system has to have, quote, a reliable method for you to demonstrate that you now control it. And I have a method to show that I've paid it over to you or given it over to you, and you can pay you the money. So what is a reliable method? Well, that's a very interesting question. And that's one where, frankly, I think Chris Southworth's the only person in the world who thinks that's been solved. But so it's useful to have him here. Everybody else in the world is saying, we don't know what a reliable method is. I wonder what kind of technology you need to do that. Do you need to encrypt it this way? Do you need to have that kind of algorithm? How are we going to do that? What they have done in the United Kingdom with the Electronic Trade Documents Act that Chris mentioned is essentially to say, well, you know what? The system produces reliability. All the participants strive for reliability, and they're not going to make business deals without the reliability. So you've got IT people, whether it's a service provider or whoever, who says, yes, here's the electronic document, and we've got it nailed down so you can't fool around with it. And then you've got insurers who say, yeah, insurers for the shipping trade, for example, who say, yes, that's going to be reliable. We're not putting our cargo at risk if we use that electronic version. And you've got the banks, the financiers, who say, yes, we will advance funds on that electronic document because we are convinced that it is reliable. And of course, the merchants, the buyers and the sellers are going to say, well, I'm not going to pay somebody unless I have a reliable, even electronic, but a reliable document that tells me that I'm entitled to it and not the 99 other people who might have a copy. And if I have to put it onto paper in order to present myself at the dock, then I must be able to demonstrate reliably that it's been turned into paper. So if everybody in the system is working to the same end, which is, this is reliable, I'm not spending my money until I know it's reliable, everybody in the system says it's reliable, then in that case, we don't have to second guess the law. You say, reliable method? The reliable method is what everybody uses. And it works. And as Chris said, they passed the law last year. and they're working. It is functional in England. So the reliable method is what people think are reliable. And in fact, the UNCITRAL model laws for more than 20 years, but certainly the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transmittal records says a reliable method may be done by showing reliable methods at each stages, but it may also be shown by the fact that the thing worked, that it in fact served to transfer the title to the documents, that the goods were delivered when the electronic document was put into the warehouse's computer, that the money changed hands in a bank account, which was probably all digital as well, when the bank saw the electronic demonstration that the money should be transferred. So if it works in practice, that is a demonstration that it works in law. And you can't go behind that to say, well, my lord, you're pleading now in the Supreme Court of wherever it happens to be, well, my lord, or well, your honor, I can show you, I've got my technical experts to come in to show you why that wasn't reliable. And that was, we could have attacked it that way, we could have attacked it this way. And the judge says, yes, well, counsel, that's all very interesting, but did it not, in fact, work to deliver the goods and to have the money change hands? Well, yes, I'm afraid it did.
John,
sorry.
I think I really think that you've touched on something that's very important when looking at legal reform, establishing a framework for reliability. So there's a common universal truth with regard to document processing. I think one of the things that is equally important, and I want to invite each member of the panel, I'm going to start with Chris, and give you all one universal question, because this is going to also influence our interactive session that comes after, where I want to hear your opinion. What do you think we should prioritize? So I know, John, you've focused on reliability framework, as well as putting in place model laws such as Melita. But what are the key areas in our legislative ecosystem do we need to address within the region to allow for the build out of a resilient and sustainable and reliable framework for digital trade? So Chris, perhaps I can start with you. I can ask you to give me your main highlight points that you'd want to put forward to everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, Vashti. And I totally take the points about reliability. I think I'm a former government policymaker, just to be clear. I used to work for the UK government. I used to devise policy for ministers. I understand the government perspective, I really do. But the issues around reliability are really important in the sense that you've got to understand this from the private sector perspective. From industry, which is the majority of trade, the government element of trade is very, very small. Most of trade just goes on without government involvement whatsoever. The only reason reliable systems and reliable clauses were put into the UK Electronic Trade Documents Act was actually a latter thought. It wasn't originally in the law. It was only there just to put people's minds at rest. What actually then happened is it then created this sort of huge question around reliable systems. But if you look at this from a business perspective, companies don't use unreliable systems. And if you do, you're going to go out of business very quickly. Most of the companies around transactions, which is largely what we're talking about here, are working with the banks who are highly regulated, highly audited. They're not dealing with unreliable systems at all. In fact, I haven't heard anyone talking about unreliable systems for quite some time from an industry perspective. However, I think we have to take the point around there needs to be a trusted system. But if we're going to have a system, it has to be global. The ICT Digital Standards Initiative, which was referenced earlier on, is working on a reliable framework, reliable systems framework. That for us is got to be the solution if we need one. But the perspective we're coming from in an English law perspective, which is important in the Commonwealth viewpoint, is where's the evidence? There's no evidence of a failure. There's no evidence of any court asking about reliable systems. There's no evidence for the problem. So let's not create complexity where it's not needed. Let's be pragmatic. If there is a failure and clear evidence of that at scale, then of course, then a system is needed. But what we don't want to do is remove legal barriers, enable a cheaper, faster system, and then at the same time implement 188 different accreditation and reliable systems frameworks, which all it will do is just create a load of bureaucratic red tape and bureaucracy for no reason whatsoever, with no evidence behind it. That's a fear of governments, to be clear, not business. Businesses will always use a reliable system because they have to. Otherwise, they can't operate properly. So I think we have to keep that really, really in mind in terms of the reliability question. But I'll come back to the government perspective. The job of government, first and foremost, is to empower, enable, and motivate. So in terms of enabling, remove legal barriers, then the system will go paperless. Empower in terms of being proactive, not passive, active in the market in terms of educating, sending clear messages, and the point was made really well earlier on, that the private sector will respond to that. And then finally, empower the market to change, because the private sector will drive the transition if it is empowered to do so. But the governments, I should say, in plural, and I have to say the Caribbean is well placed to do this, is to drive the change and lead by example. And then the private sector will 100% respond. Because from a private sector perspective, everyone's up to their eyeballs in red tape, bureaucracy, antiquated systems. I made the point in the chat room about future talent development. There's lots of reasons why the business case is there to drive the change. But don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple. Start where you start. Don't, try and be all things to all people, but just get the basic foundations in place. From that, we can build. But at the moment, we're in a bit of a logjam in terms of just convincing and persuading legal reforms. And I would just finish that off with just saying that we are really concerned that if governments are not getting the legal environment in place now, because that takes time to go through parliaments and legislation processes, they're going to be really left behind. SMEs are going to get really left behind and become uncompetitive against other companies in other countries who can transact in an hour, can cut costs by 80%. That should, if we're successful, be absolutely the most beneficial in regions like the Caribbean. Otherwise, we've all failed. We do not want to see a dual-track world where the G7 moves on and everybody else is left behind. That was absolutely not the rationale behind anything on the Melita kind of proposition, ICC's proposition, the UK proposition on electronic trade documents. That was not what it was about. It was all about inclusion, everybody benefiting, everybody winning. But to do it, we need action, cooperation. Let's get the fundamentals into place and go forward from there. And don't overcomplicate it in terms of legal questions for business unless there's evidence for it. Let's be evidence-led.
Excellent. So, Sanya, what are the things we need to do to put in place to ensure that we're not going to be left behind? What would you like to tell the government?
It's a very good question. And following from Chris's intervention, it had me thinking. I think the core premise that has come from the two previous speakers would be the issue of reliability. And reliability also equals trust. It's part of the definition of it. And to trust a system means that you have to have, particularly legal systems, that you have to have a robust enforcement mechanism. This tends to be the problem with certain legislation that we enact in the Caribbean. And we're speaking about IT, information technology. We're talking about systems that are quite new, to an extent, to the region. The expertise to be able to assist in the enforcement has to be built. The private sector has to feel comfortable that not only is there a robust or a sufficient enforcement mechanism, but there are alternative options for dispute resolution when there are issues with respect to electronic transactions or digital trade. So we also have to look at the system itself, and I'm speaking from a larger Caribbean perspective, because we always think that it's a law that needs to be passed, a regulation which is barely passed in most instances, that would solve a problem. But you have to go to the heart from the point of the development, not only of the policy, but looking at the people involved. Do you have enough experts to do the research, to draft the legislation, to enforce it, and to ensure that the system is strong enough so that the private sector and the general consumer could benefit from utilizing the system? And I think that, if you're looking at it from a legal perspective or a legislative perspective, is really the heart of the problem. Most of our jurisdictions do not possess the capacity. So that's why we have to leverage the partnerships that we're speaking about today, to be able to facilitate that subsidiarity, and that we're able to participate, whether it be at the regional, the global level, to get the technical expertise to either facilitate knowledge transfer or to be able to provide capacity building so that we're empowered to do what is necessary to make sure that our system is reliable and trustworthy and user-friendly. And that's what I would say.
Wow. That is a very tremendous call to action. And Mr. McCarthy, I am sure you're going to give a response about the agility of the government and what are the responses and what are the steps you're going to put in place.
Right. So the government has a huge responsibility. The government has a lead role to play in facilitating digital transformation, not just internally within the government, but to facilitate digital transformation throughout the entire country. So the legislation is very important, and to focus on the kinds of legislation that I think are needed. Critically, we need legislation that creates standards, drive e-commerce, consumer protection, digital transaction, and things of that nature. But I also believe that, especially listening to colleagues around the table, that partnerships are critically important in doing all of these things. So partnerships are important because government needs to bring to the table all the expertise that is available to us, wherever that expertise is. Universities, the private sector, schools and colleges, civil society organizations, we need the expertise. Because we're small countries, government doesn't have nearly all the resources that we need to do that. So leveraging the expertise that we have, any and everywhere that it exists, it's critically important. Secondly, we need partnerships because we need advocacy for the change that we need. And so we need the churches, we need schools, we need youth organizations, and so on and so forth. We need regulators, we need business community to partner with us in advocating for the kind of change that we need. And change can be very, very difficult. And thirdly, partnership is important because research and development are always important. And so we need to leverage the expertise that we have, institutions, educational institutions in particular, and in some private sector organizations to lead on research and development. And of course, the idea of regional cooperation, international cooperation, and these kinds of issues is also critically important if we're going to achieve the change that we need.
That's absolutely amazing. And I'd like to stress and underscore and agree with the importance of partnerships, because it is clear that the government creates the enabling environment, the business drives trade and commerce. And that brings me to that Caribbean business perspective, Lisa. What do you think needs to be put in place?
So I want to segue a little bit into a little discussion about technology, because the legislative framework, I am convinced, with the right will, with the cooperation of all of the stakeholders, can be implemented and in a way that will drive the growth in trade that we anticipate. One of the things that we have not talked about, and I pressed your representative from the ICC very much on this topic of technology. What is it that you are asking the private sector and the governments to implement from a technology perspective that, by the way, must integrate with ASICUDA, must integrate with single electronic window? What is there some global platform? And interestingly, in the report, in the presentation that the rep from the ICC made, she said that in 2023, they published a digital trade standards report and trusted technology. Trusted technology. From the private sector perspective, we want to understand not just the legislation, not just how we will have to adjust our business practices to comply, but we also want to understand what technology we have to adopt, what will be put in place, and will it integrate to existing systems. So those are the kinds of things that from a private sector perspective we would want to see. You know, I go back to my days as a young pup in the legal field. I was acting Attorney General in Turks and Caicos Islands. And as Attorney General, you were a member of the cabinet as well as a member of parliament. I was very young in those days. And the legislative drafting department was really good at drafting legislation. It would go to the parliament, it would get passed and so forth. And it comes now to the governor to assent. And he says, I refuse to assent to any legislation unless you satisfy me that the administrative arrangements to give effect to that legislation and to enforce it are in place at the same time. You know, it used to create a lot of tension in the cabinet, right? Because, you know, ministers would say, but, you know, the legislative will of the people has been manifested in the passage of this legislation. How could you block it? But he was right, because so many times we have the experience of passing legislation, it's on the books, but it can't be enforced because we have not put in place the regulatory arrangements, the administrative arrangements to give effect to it and to enforce it. So that's the perspective from the private sector.
Well said, and you are still very young. Having worked with Lisa for a number of years, she always brings that degree of wisdom and experience to bear and thinks outside the box always. And coming to wisdom and experience, I'm going to ask John to give us what is his final message that he would like to impart to the members at this workshop. What would be your pearl of wisdom to our Caribbean participants? John.
Well, if there's one, I will say you're not alone. A lot of people have faced the same issue. I just read the reports on the assessment of legal and technical readiness for paperless trade for Tonga and Tuvalu, which done by ESCAP and done last year and the year before. And they are in exactly the same position. They've got bills that were approved for policy in 2016 that haven't been passed. They've got it passed and nothing happens. Frankly, it happens in Ontario. I mean, I come from Canada and it's a nice, rich, sophisticated jurisdiction. We have all sorts of pep rallies for civil servants on delivery. You know, yes, you can do the policy, but where's the product? What is happening? Who's watching? Did it work? I mean, right, just what Lisa was talking about, except our Lieutenant Governor doesn't say, I'm not going to give you royal assent, but nevertheless, the same question. What are you doing with it? But do not despair. Everyone is facing this. The first steps are there. The UNCITRAL model laws are there. There's a lot of work. UNCITRAL has a lot of publications. There's a lot of support out there in how you do this. How does it work? And again, this kind of forum and the kind of forum that the Commonwealth is setting up is exactly what you need to say, you know, okay, hold each other's hands. We don't know what this means. Well, we didn't, but we tried this and it worked. Or as Chris said, for the UK, which is rich and it's got what 80% of the world's trade is done under English law. So there's a lot of people looking at that. And they tried it and they say, well, once you try it, it can work. And let's wait, let's not solve problems that have not arisen. Let's just deal with the problems we know about, which is a much smaller proportion than the ones you can imagine. So confidence, look to global partners and look to each other.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd really like to invite you to give the members of the panel a hearty round of applause. And I hope you all understand that after this, it is you who will be doing the talking. So what I'd invite you to do is we're going to break for coffee, but if it's okay with you, you can bring your coffee and your refreshments into the room, and we can start on our interactive session in the next 10 minutes. Yes. So it'll be 11:10, and for those who are joining us online, you can proceed to have your virtual or in-person coffee accordingly. So we'll recommence in 10 minutes. Thank you. Part of this. For this exercise, I would need you to all whip out your phones, or I need you to go online. You can look at the top of the screen, menti.com, and enter that code. So the aim of this exercise is really to gather from you, the participants, both online and in person, what are your priorities, given the conversation that was held this morning and in developing a roadmap for the way forward. Now, to make this challenge more interesting, we do have a prize. So in front of you is this beautiful box of fine Parisian macaroons that we bought from London. And therefore, if the online participants win it, we'll have to mail it to them. So I'm really hoping that you guys in the room can step up your game. So has everyone joined? Are you seeing the Mentimeter? All right, so what I'm now requiring you to do is to provide your answers to the next questions that are coming up in the next slides. And the most responsive person or participant gets the prize. So let's go. First question. What are the biggest challenges faced in transitioning to paperless trade?
Culture.
Okay, I mean, you could speak it out, but it'll be great if you could, write it down. So humans, okay. Please feel free to put in your responses. We want to see a lot of responses going in there as to what adoption, education, skills and education, culture. I think I knew who that culture came from. Infrastructure, integration of paperwork and systems, change from traditional approaches. Any more responses? Openness. That's a really good one. Fair. I think these are all really good responses because this is going to build onto your next challenge question. Are you ready? Let's go. Oh. Leave paper-bound practices behind. Yes. What are the biggest challenges? Oh, voting. No, this is, there we go. Which legal or regulatory reform would be the most important impact on accelerating paperless trade? So you have to identify what, out of the entire suite of laws, reforms, legislation our amazing panel has put forward to you this morning, what is the most impactful to you? Oh, wow. Cybersecurity, that usually comes in as number one. Holistic review on the process. Data privacy, also a high achiever. E-commerce legislation. I wonder if we'll see an AI popping up there for regulation. Are there any more responses in the room? You can't? Or he's doing it for you on your behalf? This is some real competition happening in this corner here, guys. I love the virtual assets regulation. Blockchain technology, also very critical with regard to global trade and regulatory frameworks. Intellectual property, definitely. AI, there it is, AI has entered the race. These inputs are very critical because when it comes to our intervention, we want to go with what are the regional priorities. Our next question, are you ready? Nope, not that one. Which aspect of legal reform needs immediate harmonization on the regional level? Given all of your priorities, which one do we need to address first in terms of regulation for impact? Out of all those on the list, which one has your highest priority for impact? And we're thinking, wow, this one kind of got everyone stumped. Customs and border control. I'm not too sure Chris would be very excited about this one. Sound knowledge processes to be digitized, yes. Virtual asset regulation, yes. So these are your key, immediate, short-term that you think will make the biggest impact on trade. Are there any more takers? Are you participating in this competition? All right, government. That's a very interesting response. Okay. Governments are very, so what would be the most impactful support or technical assistance that you require to really be able to transition to digital trade? So this morning we spoke about the different things that need to be done. There's legislation, there's building out technology, there's building out partnerships. What is the most impactful support? If we were to assist you tomorrow, what do you want us to assist you with? What's your priority? Project management, that's key. A sound change management is absolutely necessary for digital transition. Geared towards sensitization, equally key. Technology and policies. Training and education. Education. See that as a recurrent theme. Regional legal harmonization. Are there any other key areas? Awareness, Fast-moving pilots. That is interesting. In terms of airways or in terms of countries? Awareness, education. Now, I hope our judges are paying attention. We are. Okay. And that's it, folks. So now, I can give yourself a round of applause. Because now, I'm going to ask our judges to identify who are the winners and what were the key things that they put forward. I have Lisa, I have Sanya, and I have Nigel. So you can confer and identify among yourselves, mainly in the room. I know the culture person. I also know the virtual assets person. So are you suggesting that I'm seeing some like stern collaboration or like conferring happening among our judges. Participation was 100%. Okay, Sanya, let's hear it. And I'd like to invite Nigel, our Chief Digital Transformation Expert and Driver, to award this prize. If you'd like to come to the front. Right there, right there.
Okay. Gentlemen, the names? Okay, congratulations, guys. And just a little
Photo opportunities happening right now. I would really like to personally thank everyone who has participated, as well as those who are able to join us online. I think it has been a very illuminating, exciting, and I would think engaging session. But most importantly, this is the first step towards greater engagement within the region. You have our details, and please feel free to reach out to us, or even you can put your details or further questions in the chat. We will respond to them and reach out to you accordingly. But thank you very much for attending and your fulsome participation this morning. Yes. So what I didn't announce to our online participants is that lunch is provided, because I already rub it in with the coffee. So there is lunch that is being provided at the Calypso restaurant for participants. Please feel free. I know, Nigel, you've indicated that this is a priority. Yeah. We want to make sure that you all are... Mm-hmm. Very good.
I had one. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Rodney Lewis, and I'm a business specialist for CPU, and I'm also a governance consultant. So one of the reasons why culture stood out to me, I heard all the elaborate figures going around, and you know, it's okay for these things to work well overseas. But I'm wondering if anybody even took any consideration to how the business landscape is post-pandemic. You have the Macy's and you have the Goddards, but then you also have a lot of mom and pop shops. And the Macy's and the Goddards, they have all the infrastructure to place all these things in place, all the blockchain technology, all the security and stuff to deal with the paperless transactions. But then you also have individuals, all the individuals that might want to hold on to how they do transactions. And sometimes it's okay to say that the government will do it and the private sector will follow. By the end of the day, it isn't just a matter of a hand-handed approach. I love what you said in terms of you could put the technologies in place. By the end of the day, it comes down to the people. Yeah? And sometimes these people, you need to hold their hands to get through this. Yeah? So I'm just wondering if y'all would have considered culture. That's why it was so.
Well, if I may, so what I can say just briefly is that, yes, the private sector is aware of the need to provide that support. And you would notice even the banks have certain facilities in place to assist persons in terms of kind of like hand-holding them in the use of certain tools that they have and applications. Yes, the private sector could provide that support, and there is space for that because obviously not everything could fall to the state, but it is also incumbent on the individual to understand that things are changing, and it is their responsibility as well, if they wish to keep pace, to adapt to the technology. So if I were to give an example, not in the context of business, but just a personal example. My mother is 76, and my mother WhatsApps me. She uses emoticons. She can send voice notes, yes. My grandfather's 100, and he used to call me on WhatsApp. So it means it's a certain mindset and a willingness to jump in and be part of the change. Yes, Caribbean culture is not necessarily one that is generally open to such sort of change. And I have to go back to what Ms. Agard kept saying about AI. It is very important. Yes, AI is a buzzword, but we have to get down correctly to the nitty-gritty of regulating. First of all, understanding. Once you understand regulating proper use, and it may not mean putting in, as I said, laws and regulations, but maybe having standards. And so companies would know what to adopt and to operate in a particular space in a particular way, but also to inform the public about these standards. And that's where the consumer protection aspect comes in, which was what we would have been indicating. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, people don't shift easily, but it is their responsibility. The private sector can assist, the public sector can assist, but it's a whole of society approach.
So let me share some experiences that I have, because I've run telcos, yeah? And I've run an incumbent telco, so the culture piece is critically important. Changing the culture to be nimble and fast in a highly competitive environment is a very difficult task. But there are some very well-established approaches that can be adopted where you get your staff engaged around more purpose than values these days. And you can implement programs that drive values, how you live them, how you develop them, but all of that has to be done from the ground up. So how you translate transforming culture on a national level, that is very difficult. But let me talk about change management, which is another thing that you raised. For my sins, I chair something called the Northwest Regional Health Authority in Trinidad and Tobago. For my sins, right? Because it's national service, but it's hard national service. So they're responsible for certain health institutions in Trinidad, the hospital in Port of Spain, the only mental health hospital in entire Trinidad and Tobago, the National Cancer Center in St. James, and 18 health centers there. So because of my background, when I became chair a few years ago, I said, no, we don't even have a national health information management system. This is madness. So we engaged, at the time a company out of the US came and approached us and said, would you guys like to be a pilot for a health information management system? And we put up our hands. Of course, you're pushing out an open door. The biggest thing that helped us with the change management piece was actually, and it was not a bespoke solution off a shelf that we bought from this company. They actually worked with the people in the relevant institutions and designed an electronic version of the way they were doing things, but improved it. What that did was that the staff, whether it was introducing the pharmaceutical model, whether it was the patient records module, whether it's the patient's notes module, it reflected what they were already doing, but only electronically, better, faster, more efficient, and it gives everybody a 360-degree view of the patient. There was no problem with adoption. There was no problem with change management because you involve the users in the development of the system from the start.
Well, thanks very much. It's actually quite ironic that, name is Reese Campbell from Liberty Latin America. It's quite ironic that my partner here actually raised quite a few of the points that I was going to raise myself. But perhaps I want to start off my intervention by saying, first of all, the Commonwealth has a unique role in terms of pushing this legislative agenda. When we look at our legislative frameworks in the 50-plus countries in our system, we know where it came from. So when we're looking to do reforms, specifically in the Commonwealth Caribbean, there is a certain amount of help and support that we need. Because there was a section where you asked what are some of the technical capabilities. First of all, we need to look at our legislative framework and structures to see what commonalities exist and how we can fast-track the legislative movement. Second of all, I see this session as somewhat of a watershed moment for us in the Caribbean because we know the problem. From what I'm hearing in this room, we know the solution. But the biggest barrier to actually effectively implementing what's going to take us out or into the paperless era is really understanding, as we said, change management. Now, bear with me for one quick second. When we went through the pandemic, we had a almost immediate shift into moving things electronically. And what we found is coming out of the pandemic, we have regressed. And we have gone back to all of the systems that we are comfortable with, that we know, and we're somewhat stagnant. So I'm saying we can't wait on another pandemic because also we don't want another pandemic to kind of leapfrog us into the future. Second point, digital training and education. We did touch on it quite a bit. Sanya, I loved your interventions about it. And I do feel that for us to get across that hurdle, we have to have some strategic digital training, not just for children, because we tend to focus a lot on children and youth. We need to have equally a focus on adults, because guess what's happening to our adults? If they do not adapt, what you find is it's easier for a business to revert because they can't have 10 high-value adult customers complaining about a digital transformation or a digital shift. But you can have, if the young people complain about it, it's a different perspective. Truth be told, young people are not complaining about it. So I'm saying all of that to say, if we're looking at the mistrust and the distrust in our digital ecosystem, we have a responsibility, and we do it at Flow across the entire Caribbean. We're doing digital education through Jump, but we're finding a little bit of a roadblock because we need a little bit more buy-in from not just our governments, but from our people on the ground, because that's how you're going to actually make the shift and make the change. You're going to have to look at all of the people in the ecosystem and have a tailored solution for them to bring them along and across the line. And most importantly, data privacy. It's actually very interesting. I read a study once that says the people who are that millennials are not terribly concerned with data privacy, nor are Gen Zs. But guess what? Gen X, boomers are very concerned about data privacy, what happens and where it goes. So again, we need a very tailored strategy towards the different generational groups if we're going to actually take that leapfrog and take advantage of this watershed moment.
Just so, I think those are excellent points, and you have hit it on the head. One of the reasons why we have adopted this whole initiative to develop a Commonwealth model law on digital trade is there's something called a Commonwealth advantage. The Commonwealth advantage, I know it sounds cliched, but do you know that because of the similarity in laws, tradition, and even the way in which we go about our regulations, our governmental processes, Commonwealth countries are 21% more likely to trade with each other at a cost of 20% less than a non-Commonwealth country. And it's because it's easier. We've been doing it for ages, and we will continue to do so. So the development of a model framework or common framework, not in a mandatory way like a convention law, but a framework that countries can adapt based on where they're at, what are their priorities, is what we're really advocating. And I think this is why we really want to get on board the key policy makers and render that assistance to bring everybody on board to allow for interoperability. To address your second point on this training, it is something that we do in addition to, it's part of what we have budgeted for, what we have catered for. So we realize that MSMEs want to go online. They don't have the wherewithal. So you have that adult population who are business owners, but they don't know online marketing, online business strategy, online cybersecurity, how to deal with GDPR with regard to their data policies. So we have actually been working and are working with the Pacific on developing e-business toolkits for businesses, doing the training to build capacity, and also giving them a grant to get off the ground. And I think it's something that we take a public-private partnership approach with and in doing, because we understand that this is critical to the business sector, and I think it is something that we will definitely look at discussing or even collaborating with the private sector to get that done, because we understand its critical importance. So I see that you have a question.
No, it's rather a comment. So to give you a little bit of background, I have been responsible for change management initiatives in Germany with around 20,000 institutions, small companies, big companies, governments, churches, etc. So I put the point forward with fast-moving pilot projects because I think the legislation you have here is much more fit to adopt to new technology than the German one. Germans always think everything through, then they write a lot of paper, and then suddenly reality kicks in. So you have an advantage. You can adopt legislation by learning. At least that's my understanding of the law system you have here. So what I would propose, actually, set up fast-moving pilot project with small enterprises and big enterprises, because execution is completely different for these kind of entities. Learn from them and do a lot of marketing on the side. So if you have these ambassadors from the small ones and from the big ones, then you can really do change. And that's why I say fast-moving pilots. Do prototyping and not try to do it the German way and make it perfect in the beginning. This just doesn't work with technology.
Thank you, and I know we're basically almost at lunch, but I listened to the comments in this section and the intervention, of course, what the panel had to say. And Reese actually said something which aligns with my personal and I think what I've seen in terms of professional view. We have change and then we have lasting change. So persons are willing to adapt in a particular area of crisis, and COVID was that. I mean, you didn't have a choice. You weren't given a choice. But when we're given choices, you realize that how we default is to what we're accustomed to. And as such, industry actually started the change first. And it's things. So industry allowed and accommodated a lot of things online during COVID. And industry went the other direction when the pandemic started to move to endemic status. And as such, persons followed. Businesses did the same, and I said industry generally. Individual business did the same thing. You allowed work from home, and then afterwards you went back to the traditional sense that said, if I'm not seeing my employees in office, for some businesses it's a problem. And it's costing me on the bottom line, I'm not seeing my customers. As opposed to, how can I make this process even better now that we're in a new dispensation, new as in post-COVID, and get it, and make it even better. But we didn't do that. I'm saying that because when we think about trade, so Jamaica, for instance, when I was listening to some of the comments, it felt a little difficult for me in some instances, because certainly at the goods level, we have already done a lot of changes to our system. We have an Asikuda system, or customs system is relatively paperless. And I recall very well, both from friends and also because of, we're there working in some aspects from the e-governance standpoint, all of the noise that took place when we had to change the system. And it can't work. And they had to have meetings and everything. But eventually, if you said to the customs or to the persons who were doing it, they had to just fall in line. It have teething pains, kick in, no problem. As the persons who had to interface, we had to learn how to do it and to fall in line eventually. I say that to say that we said something, and as we look at making things borderless and paperless, we have to recognize that we have different constituents. Some constituents are persons who should be given no choice. Because the moment you offer choice, people are going to default to what is comfortable. Simple. Other constituents, we have to realize that even though we think they're digital natives, they're operating digitally. It's very limited. They're interested in what is social, not necessarily what is commercial and trade. And for those constituents as well, we have to, there's a thing I heard someone say once, and I don't like it, but it works. Maybe there are some constituents, when you think about trade, they will not be our focus because they have alternatives. They have, like your mom, they have me. Kid, and you do it. It's okay. It's okay. But there's a generation to come that should not be given that choice. They shouldn't be given that choice. Because again, if you start like that, you're going to have a generation that says, oh, it can be done this way or that way. When something is innate, you don't know anything different. But once you offer choices, and that's how I feel, for instance, when I look at how trade operates. So, final example, we have a craft market, and our craft market, they operate in a particular manner. So, they accept cash and they accept cashless. And some persons do cash, some persons do cashless. And what they have done, because there's a cost issue, of course, with cashless payments, what they have done is that they say, okay, some persons are the ones who offer the cashless methodology, others don't offer it. And they pull it together to say, if you want to use your card, I'll send you to that merchant. She'll do it on my behalf and send the money to me. And when you interrogate it some more, of course, there's an issue because, of course, there is a cost to doing cashless transactions. But the other thing is, no, it's all right. I mean, I want to take on that, the stress there, for deal with that. Because they have an option. They have an option. And if you make the option as easy as the other, then they're going to default to what is native. And that's why I recognize that even in our country, we go to the States, last point, we buy prepaid credit and debit cards, we have no problem. Ask us to do it in Jamaica and to have options of cashless for even the unbanked. If it's a prepaid card, you don't need to necessarily go to a bank. They're not doing that because they have options. So my point again, let's recognize that we have different constituents, but the moment you offer persons options to do what is actually what is transformational and what is traditional, people are not going to default automatically to transformational. It's not going to happen.
Just one point quickly. Although I agree with you in principle about the martial law approach to implementation, you still have to make sure you have the right frameworks for the persons then that are not just being delinquent, but persons that actually cannot go in the direction that you want them to go in. So, as I said already, I agree with you in principle, but we still have to be very balanced when doing this. That's all.
I believe Chris Southworth has his hand up because he also wanted to make a point. Chris?
Yeah, hi everybody. This conversation is music to my ears, to be honest. I mean, for what it's worth, I think we're having a very similar conversation in the UK, but also there are similar conversations going on in Asia and other parts of the world. You know, I think the speaker earlier absolutely nailed it in the sense that we know what the problem is, we know what the solution is. This is all about change management, and we have gone backwards since COVID. I fully agree with that. I think the issue with trade is, from a government point of view, too often it gets put in the too difficult box. So you're dealing with domestic issues because that's where obviously the political pressure is. We all get that from a business point of view. But from a trade point of view, you know, it gets put in the too difficult box. We can't do this because it's too complex for one reason or another. Let's leave it for now. And we're dealing with that. But the system at the moment makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to the next generation coming through, who are digital natives. They expect us all to be using technology. You know, we're talking about legislation for e-signatures. To be honest with you, I don't know who's using e-signatures, but you know, lots of the world is biometrics. You know, it's fingerprints, it's mobile phones. You know, why are we talking about e-signatures? It doesn't make much sense. You know, we're so much more advanced in terms of technology and solutions than where the regulations and where government's thinking is at. And some of it is sort of fear driven. But just to come back to the point, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that we're not really talking about trade digitalization here. We're talking about change management. In other words, it's a classic change management approach. You know, we need to build the case studies, the economic case, the champions, those who are, you know, first movers, to help us all make the case as to why the market should move. We all share that common goal, I think. And then just to go back to my original point, you know, for those in government, we've got to think bigger than customs. And it's all about ecosystem. However, we're all behind from the private sector. That point was made earlier on. You know, with the government sort of leverage and empowerment, the private sector, the numbers speak for themselves. No CFO is going to sit on a table and say, hey, I'm going to deny 80% cost reduction, or why shouldn't I do a transaction in an hour versus 3 months? No CFO. Well, if you are, you're going to be out of business very quickly. You know, businesses respond very quickly to that sort of economic benefit if we can allow and communicate and work together. And that's where we have a huge advantage. And just to come back to the Caribbean, I remember the session we had with the Commonwealth earlier last year. I was so struck by the legal frameworks in the Caribbean. It is a long way ahead of other parts of the world. There's a huge advantage here for the Caribbean to help lead and help influence the rest of the world, because all of us need the rest of the world to do this as well as us. That's the point. That's why everybody holds back. Everybody looks at everybody else to say, if I'm doing it, are you doing it? And if you're not doing it, why should I do it? That's why nothing changes in trade. However, if the Caribbean lead, the Commonwealth lead, the global movement lead, that's the big advantage. And to my German colleague, I've had lots of very funny conversations with my German colleague in ICC. You know, we have a huge advantage in English law with the Commonwealth advantage that we are agile. It's no surprise that the first movers in this sort of general trade digitalization movement are English law related. It's quite interesting, but it's quite clear too. And I think that's part of the fact that we are more pragmatic, we're more agile, we're more able to move with it because the law allows us to do it, providing the governments enable us to put those legal frameworks in place. That's the big opportunity in front of us. But I would say the Caribbean should be leading, along with the rest of the vanguard of those who are leading, definitely not behind the curve. That's the fear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more comments? I think this has been such a healthy and productive and enlightening engagement and discussion, and I really look forward to us taking this further. And you've gotten the call to action. There's nothing that holds us back from doing the necessary reforms to take the Caribbean forward as a leader within the global trade space. So unless we have any further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for your very wholehearted and fulsome participation and support, and look forward to engaging with you all further. Now you can go to lunch.
So last year I went to China, and as a host of a large technology company in China, who shall remain nameless, right? Every single transaction that a consumer does is done through this device. Everything. You could buy a house, you could buy a car, you could sell a thing, every single transaction. One night we were having dinner at a hotel. Your girl feeling a little sick. I forget my vitamin C home. So I said to my host, I said, could we stop at a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel to buy some vitamin C? He cracked up laughing, fall off his chair laughing. And I'm like, but I'm sick, I just want some vitamin C. Why we can't stop in the pharmacy? Well, dinner, we went back to the hotel. When I got back to the hotel, my vitamin C was waiting for me because he ordered it on the phone and had it delivered to the hotel for me. So the notion for Chinese of going to a physical establishment like a pharmacy and food and anything else they want to buy is unknown. And guess what? Maybe a little in some constructs, a little bit of forcing things on people works. As you say, don't give them a choice. Yes, yes.
No, I was sharing the view that usually commercial ends usually drive the implementation of these solutions. Once it makes, if there's a commercial case for it, I can guarantee you, if there are no barriers to doing business, somebody could be a young entrepreneur, will see the opportunity and will seize that opportunity. I think the main thing is for you not to, for you to remove the barriers to commerce. Otherwise, the market will provide a solution. Once it makes business sense to be more efficient, because I don't like to leave my house to do anything. Anything I can get done here, I don't like the traffic, I don't like the sun, I live in the Caribbean, have to deal with the sun. Once I can pay for it, once there's a solution, I seek out the solution, right? And once it's available, I'm ready to pay for it.
I'd like to make an announcement. I'd like to donate my half of my price to the panel.
Okay.
That's not happening.
Life is like a box of chocolate. Life is like a box of chocolate. It's a book. It's a book. I'm okay. You good? I'm okay. Yes, I'm okay. Really, 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 really. Yes, I'm okay.